This is the next video in our series on quadratic equations. In this video, we're going to continue to look at the quadratic formula. The discriminant is the part of the quadratic formula that is here under the square root mark. These two terms, a b squared minus 4ac, is the discriminant. Let's look at our first example. Example number 1. Okay, this is a quadratic equation. You know it's a quadratic equation because the first term, the largest exponent in the equation, is a squared. So the variable squared, so this is a quadratic equation. All right, so we're going to solve for x. So to solve this quadratic equation for x, we're going to make a puzzle box. And the last number here, the constant, that goes on the top of the puzzle box. And the middle number here, the -2, that goes to the bottom. So two numbers you multiply together to get -8, and you add together to get to -2. Well, 2 times -4, positive times negative gives you negative. 2 times 4 gives you 8. So 2 times -4 gives you 8. And on the bottom, positive 2 minus 4. 2 minus 4 gives you -2. So our two factors will be x plus 2 and x minus 4. That's your two factors. So to solve for x, we have to find the value of x that makes this equation true. Well, these two factors multiplied together is going to be 0 if this factor, the first factor, is 0, or if this factor, the second factor, is 0. Because 0 times whatever this is will give you 0. So let's look at the first one first. How do you make this first factor into 0? How could this be 0? Because 0 times whatever will give you 0. Well, if x was a -2, -2 plus 2 would be 0. So our first solution, solving for x, the first solution to this quadratic equation is x is -2. All right, now how about the second factor? How could this factor be 0? What would x have to be to make this 0? Well, 4 minus 4 would be 0. So our other solution would be x equals to 4. So the two solutions for x to solve this quadratic equation is x is -2 and x is 4. All right, let's look at another example, example 2. Okay, solve for x. We're going to find the value of x that will make this quadratic equation true. So we're going to make our puzzle box. Constant goes to the top. The term here in the middle goes to the bottom. So what can you multiply together to get to 4? And add together to get to 5? Well, 1 times 4 is 4. And 1 plus 4 is 5. So our two factors is a +1 and a +4. X plus 1 and x plus 4. Those are the two factors, factoring this quadratic equation into these two factors. Okay, we're trying to solve for x. We need to know what makes this factor 0. Well, something plus 1 is 0. What would the something have to be? -1. -1 plus 1 would make this 0. So that's one of our solutions to this quadratic equation. Okay, now how about the other factor? What would make this factor 0? Well, -4 plus 4 will be 0. So the other solution is going to be -4. So x is -1 and x is -4. Those are our two solutions to this quadratic equation. Okay, let's look at another example. Here's a quadratic equation. You know it's a quadratic equation because the coefficient is 2. Let's make our puzzle box. 5 goes to the top, 3 goes to the bottom. What can you multiply together to get to 5 and add together to get to 3? Well, the only way you could get to 5 would be 1 times 5. But 1 plus 5 is not equal to 3. And there's no other way to get to 5 besides 1 times 5. So this solution, this quadratic equation, can't be solved using a puzzle box. Our only recourse would be to maybe look at the quadratic formula. See if we could solve it with the quadratic formula, and perhaps it can't be solved at all. But certainly it can't be solved with a puzzle box. Okay, let's look at another example. Okay, solve for x using the quadratic formula. So we're going to take this equation here, we're going to run it through the quadratic formula, and we're going to try to get an answer for what is x. Okay, well, first thing we need to do is we need to figure out what is a, what is b, and what is c. The variable in front of the x squared is your a. The variable in front of your x is your b. And the constant out here on the end, that's your c. So using the quadratic formula, which is this formula right here, plug and play, we're going to put these numbers, a, b, and c, in here, where b is, where a is, and where c is. And then we'll have two numbers. One number will be b plus the square root, and the other answer for x will be b, negative b, minus this square root. Those will be our two solutions. So let's look at the first solution first. It's the negative b is 6, so negative b plus the square root. Okay, well the square root is 6 squared, which is 36, and 2 times 3 is 6, 6 times 4, 24, so 36 minus 24. So this is 12. So we have 6 over 6, which is negative 1, and then we have 6 over 6. That's where this 1 comes from here. And then we have this square root here, which is the square root of 12 over 6. So you have a negative 1 and a square root of 12 over 6. Well, if you put it in the calculator, square root of 12 over 6 is around a half. So you have positive a half and minus 1, so it's like negative a half. Okay, so let's look at the other answer. What about when you use negative 6 minus? We put a minus here instead of a plus. So over here we were doing the plus, and here's our other x over here, a minus. All right, so looking at this equation over here, this all works out exactly the same. Same 36 minus 24, same minus 6. The only difference is here you get a negative. And so here you have a minus 1 minus a square root of 12 over 6. So this is about a half. So you have a negative a half and a negative 1. So that's about a negative 1.5. So those are our two answers to this quadratic equation. All right, let's look at a classwork. Solve this quadratic equation using the quadratic formula. So pause your video, find your a, b, and c, run it through the quadratic formula, and get your two answers. X is equal to two different things. What are those two things? All right, let's look at my answer and compare it to your answer. A is 3, B is negative 9, and C is negative 5. So putting that into this equation, you have negative 9. So negative times negative is positive, so this turns positive. So you have a positive 9 up front. Inside the square root, negative 9 squared is negative 9 times negative 9. Negative times negative is positive. And over here, you have a negative 4, and here you're multiplying times a negative 5. So negative times negative is positive. So this term here also becomes positive. So inside the square root, you end up with a positive 141. So our final answer is reducing this fraction, 9 over 6. 9 over 6 reduces to 3 over 2. Now first plus square root of 141 over 6, and then minus square root of 141 over 6. So here you have the negative, minus 1, and here you have positive. Positive square root of 141 over 6, and negative square root of 141 over 6. So there's your two answers by the quadratic formula. The next thing we want to look at is how we can use the discriminant in order to find out if it's even possible to solve a quadratic equation, because some quadratic equations can't be solved. So very quickly, by looking at the discriminant, you can tell if it can be solved or can't be solved. So if you remember, the quadratic formula is this term right here inside the square root. This part right here inside the square root, that's called the discriminant. B squared minus 4ac. So you get the b from the same way that you get the quadratic formula. The b is the term in front of the x. There's your b squared A is the term at the beginning, and C is your constant. So this calculating this number right here tells you whether or not a quadratic equation can be solved. It's a really good idea to do this quick little test first before you spend a bunch of time trying to solve a quadratic equation, because the answer may be it can't be done. And then you can just quit and say it can't be answered. So if the discriminant, this calculation here, ends up being a negative number, that's when you know the problem can't be done, there is no solution, and you can quit. If, on the other hand, the discriminant is a 0, then there is an answer, but there's just one answer. Unlike most of the quadratic equations we've been solving that had two answers, two values of x that would solve every quadratic equation, if the discriminant is 0, then there's only one answer. And then the normal situation is when the discriminant is a positive number, any positive number at all, which will tell you that there are two answers and you can find them, either by using puzzle boxes or by using the quadratic formula. All right, let's look at an example. Can you solve this quadratic equation? Well, let's go ahead and start with it using the quadratic formula. And we're going to plug in A, B, and C. So A is -4, well, A is 3, B is 4, and C is 5. So plugging all that in, we end up with 4 squared is 4 times 4 is 16, 3 times 5 is 15, and 4 times 15 is 60. So you have 16 minus 60. So you have more negatives here inside the square root than you have positives. 16 positives and 60 negatives. So the number inside, when you put these together, 16 minus 60, you end up with a -44 inside the square root. Well, you can't do that because you cannot take the square root of a negative number. That has no meaning in math. Only square roots of positive numbers can actually be calculated. So a -44 inside a square root is not a number. That's just the end of the problem. You can't do this. There's no solution because square roots can't be negative numbers. You can't take the square root of a negative number. So notice that this part inside of the square root, that's the discriminant. And that's why the discriminant tells us whether or not a quadratic can be solved, because if the discriminant ends up being a negative number, then what you're saying is that there's a negative number inside the square root, and you can't do that. So that's the end of the problem. There is no solution to this quadratic equation, and we stop and say, no solution. There are no real answers to this quadratic equation. All right, let's look at another example. In this example, we're not going to try to solve the quadratic equation. We're just going to test the discriminant. Let's just test the discriminant to find out if it could be answered, if this quadratic equation has a solution, and if it does it have one solution or two solutions? So we're going to test the quadratic equation with the discriminant. So the discriminant, number up front is the A, the number in the middle is the B, and the number at the end is the C. And the discriminant is B squared minus 4AC. So let's plug in 5 for the B. 5 times 5 is 25. And let's plug in 2 for the A and 3 for the C. So 2 times 3 is 6, and 4 times 6 is 24. So you end up with 5 squared is 25. 4 times 2 times 3 is 24. 25 minus 24 is 1. 1 is a positive number. If you remember the rules, anytime you get a positive number, any positive number for the discriminant, that means there'll be two answers. It means there is answers. You can get answers to this quadratic equation. You can solve this for x, and there will be two answers, two different values for x that will solve the equation. If our discriminant had come out negative, then that means there's no answers and we could quit. But since we now know there's two answers, we could go back and use the quadratic formula and solve this equation. All right, let's look at another example. Again, we're going to test the discriminant to find out how many answers will there be to solve for x. So we're not going to try to solve this for x, we're just going to find out how many answers there are. All right, we need to find A, B, and C. You notice that the middle term here is missing. we have the x squareds and we have the constant at the end, but we don't have the x's. So that means there must be 0 x's. So the middle term, the b, is a 0. So testing the discriminant, we're going to plug in 0 for b, 1 for a, because there's 1x squared there. So we're plugging in 1 for a, and -3 for c. So 0 squared is still 0. And here we have a -4 being multiplied times a -3. So negative times negative is positive. Negative times negative is positive, and we end up with negative times negative is positive. They cancel each other out, and we get a positive 12. So that's a positive number. So 12 is positive. So according to the rules of discriminants, if you get a positive number for the discriminant, that means there will be 2 answers that you can find for this quadratic equation. If you'd gotten a negative number, then that would have meant that there were no answers and there is no way to solve this equation. Or if you'd gotten a 0, that means there's 1 answer. So the discriminant tells you how many answers you will get. Because we got a positive number, there's 2 answers. All right, let's try this classwork. We're going to test each one of these equations for the discriminant. Find the discriminant for each one, and the discriminant will tell you how many answers you'll get for these equations. Will you get 1 answer, 2 answers, or no answers at all because the problem can't be solved? So if you need to, go back and watch the last example 7 over again. Pause this video and see if you can solve this equation to find out. You don't need an answer for what the x is. We just want to know, test the discriminant, and how many answers will there be. So test this first one, and then compare your answer to my answer. All right, let's look at my answer and see what you got. I say you can get 2 answers, meaning that the discriminant is a positive number. All right, pause the video and try the second one. Okay, I got no answers. The discriminant I got from this, calculated my discriminant, and I got a negative number. That meant that there's no way to solve this equation. There are no answers. This problem cannot be done. Not by the quadratic formula or any other way. This problem has no solution. All right, let's test the discriminant on the next one. Pause your video, and then we'll test the next one. Okay, let's look at my answer. I got, again, no answers. For this one here, I got a negative number for my discriminant, which means that there is no answer. This problem cannot be done. There's no solution, no value of x that you could put in for x that would ever make this statement here true. All right, let's try the last one and pause your video. Okay, the answer I got was 1 solution, 1 answer, because the discriminant I got when I calculated my discriminant was 0. And when you get a discriminant of 0, that means there will be only 1 answer to that quadratic equation. So x is only 1 possible thing, 1 number, and that will be the only number, and it does solve the equation. All right, that's the last one. Thank you for watching the video.